This weekend, Formula 1 returns to Melbourne for the first round of the 2025 F1 season, and in doing so will celebrate 40 years of the Australian Grand Prix. So, in a bit of a different video today, I wanted to give you guys a brief history of the Australian Grand Prix. Our story first takes us back to 1985 and the beautiful city of Adelaide. The circuit had been developed to use roads around the city centre and the East Parklands and was your stereotypical 1980s Formula 1 street circuit. It was bumpy, it was quite dangerous in places, and it was a very happy hunting ground for Ayrton Senna, who would take the first pole position at the new venue, driving for his Lotus Renault team. The Australian hosts had hoped for a title decider to kind of kickstart their new F1 Grand Prix, but unfortunately for them, Alain Prost had already wrapped up the title with a few races to go, so 1985's race would be more of a test run, if you will, for things to come in the future. It would be, however, the last ever race for Niki Lauda in Formula 1, and it looked like it was going to be a fairy tale story for the Austrian. He was leading the Grand Prix with on lap 57. Unfortunately, he would suffer brake failure and ultimately end one of Formula 1's most illustrious careers in a rather disappointing way. It would also be Keke Rosberg's last ever Formula 1 Grand Prix victory, with the two Ligiers of Jacques Lafitte and Philippe Streiff joining him on the podium. It was a pretty successful event. There would be no major issues in the first ever Adelaide Grand Prix, but as so many races were back in this time in Formula 1, it was a race of attrition. Only 8 cars finished the first ever race at the circuit, but like I mentioned, it was liked by both drivers and fans, especially the Brabham Straight leading into the hairpin of turn 11, allowing drivers in some of the faster cars to approach 200 miles an hour, something that had never really been seen on street circuits before. Adelaide, though, would play host to some other memorable moments throughout its time in Formula 1, from the title decider of 1986, which would again see Alain Prost win his second World Championship, this time round though getting the better of the Williams pair of Nigel Mansell and Nelson Piquet in a three-way showdown. It also hosted the shortest ever Formula 1 Grand Prix of all time, when just 14 laps would be completed in the 1991 race before the heavy rain was deemed too dangerous to continue driving. Of course, that record will then get smashed by the Belgian Grand Prix of 2021. 1993 saw both Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost each scoring their last ever Formula 1 podiums at the venue, but the one Adelaide moment that sticks out to fans more than any other has to be the infamous title decider of 1994. Michael Schumacher came to Adelaide leading the World Championship by just 1 point over Damon Hill. Both drivers were looking to win their first ever World Championship, but for Damon, he was also the son of F1 legend Graham Hill and could become the first ever father-son combo to win F1 World Championships. It would be Damon's teammate though, Nigel Mansell, who had come back from sabbatical and competing in IndyCar throughout 1994, who would take pole position, and it was expected that he would just help Damon throughout the Grand Prix to make sure that Williams walked away with their third straight Drivers' World Championship in a row. Schumacher though would split the Williams lineup come the end of qualifying and would line up P2 on the grid. His goal was simple as he went into race day Sunday. He just had to try and beat Damon. However, all of Williams' strategy immediately got turned on its head at the start of the GP. Nigel Mansell would get off to a terrible start, allowing both of the championship protagonists past him before he even got into turn 1. He then simply would just not have the pace to match the other two throughout the entirety of the Grand Prix, and would pretty much immediately become a non-factor in the World Championship hunt. Schumacher would lead Damon Hill throughout the opening stages of the Grand Prix, but by lap 30 36, Hill had really started to prove that he had the upper hand and was starting to catch Schumacher at a rapid rate. Under increasing pressure, Michael were on wide at the entrance of the East Terrace corner, hitting the wall with the right side of his car and ultimately picking up damage. As Damon came around the turn, he noticed Schumacher slowing in front of him and made a desperate dive to the inside of Michael to try and make the move. In a last desperate attempt from Schumacher to keep his first ever World Championship hopes alive, he would turn in on the Williams car, sending him into the air and ultimately taking them both out of the Grand Prix. Williams would call for Michael to be disqualified from the championship, but the result stood and Michael Schumacher became the first ever German Formula 1 World Champion, and it would ultimately lead to this iconic shot that has lived, throughout both Michael's legacy in Formula 1 and just general Formula 1 infamy ever since. It would easily be Adelaide's most kind of iconic moment in Formula 1, and like I said, I think for most F1 fans is the moment they always think about when you're reminded that this circuit existed. After 1995 though, Formula 1 would move to a new home and the Albert Park circuit that we know and love to this day. It was very clear that the circuit followed some similar design choices to what had worked over at Adelaide. Again, it was a street circuit. Again, it was based close to the city centre, but built in one of the kind of parklands that Australia's actually got quite a lot of in all of their cities. It was a lot faster and felt a lot more purpose-built than the Adelaide circuit. Albert Park had just two 90-degree corners on the layout in comparison to Adelaide's 4 that we'd seen throughout its time there. However, shifting now to become the season opener as well, rather than the season finale, Melbourne would also play host to some wild and unpredictable races in the 30 years since it started life in Formula 1, and that would kick off immediately with a classic in 1996. Jacques Villeneuve had aced the 1995 IndyCar season, becoming champion in just his second time of asking, and being the son of F1 legend Gilles Villeneuve, it would not be long before Formula 1 teams came knocking at his door. Williams had been desperate to make a move for a new driver since losing Nigel Mansell to IndyCar in 1994, but this was a very weird time when Formula 1 drivers and IndyCar drivers often tried to make the switch. Like we said, Mansell had seen huge success with this, winning the 1993 IndyCar Championship, and still to this day being the only driver that had obviously at the same time held both the F1 and the IndyCar Championship. However, Williams were kind of wise to this. They had invested heavily in Jacques, doing a lot of private testing, making sure that he was well prepared for life in Formula 1, and as a rookie, he rocked up to Albert Park and immediately took pole position over his teammate Damon Hill. It hasn't happened often in Formula 1, but something that had happened even less was that for a driver to win on debut. Sadly, it wouldn't happen for Jacques. Mechanical issues would ultimately cost him the win. He would drive home though to P2, finishing behind his teammate Damon Hill in what would be a historic Williams 1-2, leading Damon to his first World Championship in 1996. However, sadly, something that doesn't get talked about enough was that already there was a glaring issue with Formula 1's new Albert Park circuit. The heavy braking zones of Turn 1 and Turn 3, especially when the cars were bunched up on lap 1, had led to Martin Brundle suffering a huge crash in towards the first corner. Luckily, he was uninjured this time round, but a marshal by the name of Graham Beveridge was not so lucky in 2001. After Jacques Villeneuve's BAR would collide with Ralf Schumacher, a wheel from his car would be ripped away from the suspension, and in a freak accident would hit Beveridge in the chest. The incident was investigated by the FIA, however the Australian Grand Prix Corporation were blamed in what was described as an avoidable incident. Since then, gaps in Formula 1 fencing at all venues has been made smaller. Obviously, there's normally gaps in the fences for things like TV cameras and a few other little bits and pieces, but these now have to be smaller than the wheel width as well of any Formula 1 car, and to this day, I believe Graham was the last ever Formula 1 marshal to pass away. He was just 52 years old when he died in 2001. But the Albert Park circuit was once again tested to its limits in 2002 when yet again Ralf Schumacher was involved in a scary lap 1 accident. This time round though, he would go over the back of Rubens Barrichello's Ferrari, and what would go down as one of the, again, iconic and quintessential Formula 1 kind of photographs, if you will, of Ralf Schumacher's Williams, you know, sort of 6, 8, 10 feet in the air over the back of Rubens Barrichello's Ferrari. It would cause chaos for the cars behind them at the start of the race, with plenty of drivers' new seasons already being over before race 1 had really begun. But it would lead Mark Webber to a 5th place finish to kickstart the year for Minardi. So, you know, something good did come out of all the chaos of 2002. From then on, the venue has seen so many different and interesting moments, of course. Being the season opener on so many occasions, it saw the arrival of Lewis Hamilton in 2007, where he would go around the outside of his teammate and reigning world champion Fernando Alonso at turn 1. The 2008 Grand Prix remains a personal favourite of mine ever in F1. Again, seeing chaos and reliability issues, and the first race without traction control in which just 6 cars made it to the checkered flag and were still running. The 2009 event witnessed the start of Brawn GP's success story, as Jenson Button would win his first of 3 Australian Grand Prix in what would become a storybook 2009 season for him and the team. The 2014 Grand Prix ushered in a new age of turbo hybrid Formula 1 cars, in which young Australian Daniel Ricciardo, making his debut for the Red Bull Formula 1 team, would shock the world by almost stealing pole position away from what would be quite clearly a dominant Mercedes car throughout 2014. He would also become the first Australian to get a podium at their home GP, before sadly he was disqualified post-race for a technical infringement on his car. The 2016 Grand Prix saw another massive accident in a similar vein to what we saw back in the early 2000s. This time Fernando Alonso would flip over the back of Esteban Gutierrez's Haas car in what was Haas's first ever Formula 1 Grand Prix down at turn 3. Like I said, this accident was eerily close to what we saw back in the early 2000s. Luckily Fernando was able to walk away with no major injuries, and yet luckily since then Albert Park has often been a little less chaotic. 2019 would see Valtteri Bottas remind the world just how good he can be behind the wheel of a Formula 1 car, winning the race by almost 30 seconds over his teammate and by then 5-time world champion Lewis Hamilton. And then after that, obviously with COVID seeing the cancellation of the Grand Prix through 2020 and 2021, it was decided again that Albert Park would see its first major changes to the venue since its debut 25 years prior. Almost every single corner on the lap had been reprofiled, turn 9 and turn 10 were completely removed from the circuit, and pretty much every change was made to try and make the circuit faster and slightly easier to overtake as well. And it's safe to say, with the new ground effect era of cars, it's worked. All 3 Australian Grand Prix have been very, very interesting since obviously all of these track changes and obviously the car changes as well. The 2023 Grand Prix easily steals the show though out of the 3. 2 red flags, 2 late race restarts, and honestly for me, the thing that I remember the most from this was Nico Hülkenberg getting robbed of a podium. His first ever Formula 1 podium and Haas's first ever Formula 1 podium because of the weird countback rules that Formula 1 follows. Last year's event saw Max Verstappen suffer a brake failure, allowing Carlos Sainz to win the Grand Prix in his return after having surgery. The Australian GP is really an all-time classic in Formula 1, and I hope this 40th anniversary race will live up to the hype that this circuit has delivered time and time again. Thank you all so much for watching this admittedly very different video. Hopefully it's something you guys have enjoyed, and obviously if you have, please do make sure, like I said, you leave a like and let me know down in the comments below. Like I said, if this is something you've enjoyed, then we will certainly make more of these. I want to do more videos kind of discussing real life Formula 1 throughout 2025. But yeah, that's going to do us for this one though, and we'll be back very soon with more Formula 1 content.